pull will increase the uptake of ions by roots. Okay, so the transpiration, the rate uptakes of ions will influence by the transpirations rate. Kalau waktu tengah hari tu, where the transpirations are very high, okay, sebab cuaca panas, so the uptake of certain ions will increase. So thus, mass flow of iron through the root tissue occur due to transpiration spool in the absence of metabolic energy. Okay, so like what I was mentioned earlier, this theory, however, failed to explain uh, the subaccumulations against osmotic gradients. Okay, kalau semua ions or minerals being uptake by these mechanisms, so of course lah, bila kita check the concentrations of elements in soil solutions must be higher compared to concentrations of element in root tissues. However, certain elements, for example, phosphorus, ions, nitrogens, usually the concentrations is higher in root tissue compared to um, soil solutions. So that indicate nitrogens, ions, phosphorus are not being taken up by plant root by passive transport. Certain ions, yes. Okay, for example, sodiums. Okay, sodiums, potassiums, usually the concentrations higher in soil solutions compared to um, root tissues. Okay. The second mechanisms in passive absorptions of element is contact exchange theory. So what is contact exchange theory? According to this theory, the ion absorbs on the surface of root cells and clay particles are not held tightly, but oscillate within small volumes of space. If the roots and clay particles are in close contact with each other, the oscillations volumes of ions absorbed on root surface may overlap the oscillations volumes of ion absorbs on clay particles, and ion absorbs on clay particles may be exchanged with ion absorbs on root surface directly without being first dissolved in soil solutions. Okay, so um, elements, okay, uh, exists in different chemical forms. So like ions, usually it will bind loosely whether to salt particles or other particles. So for example, cation can loosely bind with uh, CEC. Okay, so when elements form a chemical bonds, usually it will not static. Okay, nanti kalau belajar juga dengan saya, ada satu uh, infrareds, okay, infrared spectrophotometer. So chemicals or molecules, elements that forms a chemical bond with other elements, they are not statics. Okay, for example, kalau dekat sini kita ada potassium ion. Okay, so this potassium ions might be forms chemical bond with CEC or clay. Okay, so bila dia form chemical bond with clay, dia tak static, it will oscillate, okay, at certain frequency. So if the frequency of potassiums, for example, that being loosely attached with clay or CEC, and the frequency of hydrogen ions that loosely bind with root tissue at this, dia punya apa, oscillations ni, the frequency of oscillations sama. Okay, apa yang berlaku? It can interchange, dia akan boleh bertukar. So potassiums sepatutnya sebelah sini dulu So potassiums pada awalnya dia attach dekat clay, tapi bila dia frequency of oscillations of potassiums sama dengan frequency of oscillations hydrogens that loosely bind with root hair, dia akan boleh bertukar tempat. Okay. So potassiums will bind to root tissues and hydrogens will bind to CEC or clay. So selepas this potassiums bind with root tissues, it can be absorbed by root tissues. Okay. So kalau itu, kalau awak tak faham sangat tak apa. Later kita akan bincang. Setiap molecules dia ada vibrations. It oscillate at certain frequency. Okay, dia tak static. So macam samalah. Daripada itu memang has been proven by scientists. Okay. So from that scientists dia kemukakan teori. Maybe the transportations of ion, the absorptions of ion from solutions into root tissues, dia menggunakan mekanisme yang sama by interchange context exchange theory, when two different elements that have same frequency of vibrations dia boleh bertukar tempat. Okay. Carbonic acid theory. Okay. So as you know, plant also require oxygen for respirations. Same goes to root tissues. It also required oxygen for their respirations because certain metabolic process in root tissues require oxygen, and the products of these respirations adalah carbon dioxide. Okay, so this carbon dioxide can dissolve in water solutions and will be diffused out from root cells into soil solutions or soil matrix. Okay, from root cells it goes to soil matrix. In soil matrix, the carbon dioxide can dissolve in soil solutions to produce carbonic acids. Okay, so the carbon dioxide released during respirations of root cells combined with water to form carbonic acids. Carbonic acids dissociates into hydrogens and carbonic ions in the soil solutions. The hydrogens will exchange with cation adsorbs on clay particles and cation from miscellaneous gas released into soil solutions. Okay, so the dissolve of carbon dioxide will release hydrogen ions. Okay, so the hydrogen ion, what happen kalau hydrogen ion tinggi, acidity akan tinggi. Okay, it will cause acidifications of soil. So acidifications of soil will reduce the CEC. Why? Because the hydrogen ion will bind with CEC and release the cation that initially bind to the CEC, for example, potassium. Okay, so due to the releasing of cations from CEC minerals into soil solutions, so these minerals can be absorbed by the root, the plant roots. Okay, Donans equilibriums. Okay, apa dia itu Donans equilibriums? Awak pernah dengar pasal Donan equilibriums?
Tak.
No.
Tak pernah dengar. So this is the first time awak dengar Donans equilibriums. So this is extracellular space. Okay, awak nampak kan saya punya slide kan? Sebelah kiri ni in soil solutions contains chloride ions and also potassium ions. So this is extracellular space. And di sebelah kanan ni adalah cytoplasms. So in cells there are proteins, molecules that cannot diffuse out into extracellular due to its size, sebab dia besar. Okay, for example, proteins. So these proteins, some proteins contain charge. Okay, for example, in here, these proteins contains negatively charged. Okay, so initially the cytoplasms of these cells is piped with negative charge. So what happens? It will attract potassium ion to enter to the cytoplasms to stabilize, to equilibrium, untuk menjadikan charge in the cytoplasms become neutrals or equilibriums. Okay. So for example, dekat sini ada proteins. So the charge gradients, okay, within the cytoplasms, dia negative charge dekat cytoplasm tinggi. Okay, so dia akan attract the positive charge ions, okay, yang boleh diffuse in, okay, for example, potassium to enter to the into the cell root tissues. Okay, sometimes proteins contains positively charged. Okay, if a lot of proteins in here that contains positively charged, so the cytoplasms, the total charge in cytoplasms will be positive. So it will make the chloride ion to enter into the cytoplasm through diffusions. Okay, so itu adalah Donan's equilibrium theory. Faham? Okay tak? Faham tak pasal ni? So the concentrations dia adalah passive, okay? Tapi kita tak tengok concentrations of the solutes or ions. Kita tengok concentrations of electrical charge, okay? Whether it the net charge is negative or positive, okay? So ini juga adalah, this also can trigger active transport. Okay, for example, kalau kita ingat lagi dalam active transport, especially in co-transport, in secondary active transport, if the electrical gradients of kalau sebagai contoh kat sini negative charge dia tinggi, it can induce positively charged ion to enter to the cells. But kalau the positive ions enter the cytoplasm through active transport, it must use proteins, okay, protein carrier. Masih ingat lagi kan? Okay. So the next mechanisms is carrier concepts. Okay. So this is especially involved in nitrogen's uptakes. Nitrogen's uptake involve carrier concepts, active absorptions, use energy. So the carrier proteins pick up an ions from one side of the membranes and discharge it on the other sides. Okay. Kalau kita kalau nanti kita belajarlah in plant nutrition, okay, satu-satu ion tak semestinya being uptake by plant by one mechanisms. One elements can be uptake by several mechanisms. Kadang-kadang ada active transport, sometimes passive transport, macam potassiums and sodiums can be uptake by plant by passive transport and also active transport, depend on the physiology of cells. Okay, sometimes the concentrations of ions in cytoplasm is very high and it will disrupt other metabolic process. Okay, it can kita panggil apa? Spontaneously diffuse out from the cells. Okay, so dalam keadaan tu the permeability cells membranes will change. Okay, so certain protein carrier dia tak angkut elements ni because of permeability of cell membranes affected. In certain conditions where the ion is required in high concentrations by plants, it can take the same elements using active transport. Okay, so nanti awak jangan keliru lah bila awak baca certain bab dekat buku, tengok elemen ni diambil oleh tumbuhan melalui active transport. Kalau awak baca articles yang lain, elemen yang sama diambil melalui passive transport. Okay, jangan terkeliru. Satu-satu elemen boleh diambil oleh tumbuhan melalui passive ataupun active transport. Depend on the requirement and physiology of the tissues. Okay. So macam ATP tadi ni, biasanya nitrogens being uptake by these mechanisms. Okay, awak dah tahu kan? In this protein carrier, they are active transport. Okay, when the ions bind to the active transport, it will induce the attachment of ATP. Okay, attachment of ATP will subsequently will induce phosphorylations of the ATP. ATP will become ADP. So the phosphorylations of ATP to ADP will change the conformations of proteins. So it will expose its active site, okay, from, for example, daripada sebelah luar kepada sebelah dalam. Okay, so it will make the affinity of the active site toward certain solids become lower. So the solutes or ions, compounds will detach from the protein carrier. Okay, so the detachments of the ion, solute or molecules from the protein carrier will make the protein carrier shapes become to the initial states, initial states lah. So dia akan active transport boleh ambil molekul-molekul yang lain. So dia punya turutan lebih kurang sama saja. Okay. There are also pumps, okay, protein pumps or cytochrome pump that involve in ion transportations. Okay, so ini adalah tadi active transport yang perlukan tenaga in the form of ATP. In cytochrome pumps, the active transport dia gunakan tenaga apa? Kalau awak nampak dekat sini. Awak tengok, the ferrums become 2+, 3+, 2+, 3+. Ini proses apa ni? Ingat tak? Dia dapat elektron, dia hilang elektron, dia dapat elektron, dia hilang elektron. Proses apa tu? Kalau awak ingat. Redox reaction. Okay? Redox reactions. Okay. So the redox reactions, okay, for example, in here, the anions will induce the reductions of ions, okay, and the reductions of ions will induce cascade reactions of redox reactions of ions, okay. So eventually dia apa yang jadi, dia terima electrons daripada A, dia become reduce. Lepas tu bila dia reduce, dia terima dia hantar balik electrons tu kepada A, dia become oxidized. Lepas tu apa yang jadi, another ions molecules dekat sini dia terima balik, okay, electrons daripada A ni, dia become reduced. So dia punya proses berulang-ulang kali daripada outside into inside. Okay, faham tak? So an ions ni apa yang jadi, dia akan bergerak ke dalam dan akhirnya it will taken up into cells. Okay, faham tak? Okay, for example, this is an ions, negatively charged ions. It transfers its electrons to ions. The ions become reduced. When it reduces, it's unstable. It transfers back the electrons to these elements. So these elements become reduced. So these elements then apa kita panggil, dibagi balik electrons dia dekat sini, dekat ions. Ion become reduced. Okay, so it become a cascade reactions. Okay, so these reactions finally will transport these anions from outside of the cells into inside of the cells. Okay, so the concentrations, these reactions will make anion concentrations inside the cells become higher. Okay, so it will disrupts the electrical gradients within the cells and also outside the cells. Okay, so kalau dekat sini bila anions ni bertambah tinggi, apa jadi? Apa terjadi? So the net charge inside the cells adalah negative charge. Okay, so apa yang jadi tadi? Ingat tak dominant concept theory tadi? Dia akan untuk stabilize the electrical gradients inside the cells, it will induce cations to diffuse into the cells. Okay, faham tak? Faham tak? Okay tak? Okay ke tak ni?
Faham doktor.
Okay. Okay. So what is the difference between passive and active transport? Ni ini saya rasa awak dah tahulah. Okay. But the difference between passive and active transport untuk slide ni adalah focus on absorptions of elements in roots. Okay. So passive transport do not require energy. Movement of ion along the concentrations gradients. Okay, from higher concentrations gradients, it will move to lower concentrations gradients. And rate of absorptions is depend on respirations, but rate of absorptions is not depend on respirations. And the other one adalah rate of absorptions kalau untuk passive depend on transpirations process. Okay, so saya tak include, nanti saya akan include. So ada 4 perbezaan between active transport and passive transport of mineral ion in root tissues. Okay, kita bukan cakap general dekat cells, tapi ini adalah fokus untuk root tissues. Okay, dia ada 4. For active transport, it requires energy in the form of ATP or other chemicals compounds, NADH or any reducing agents macam tadi, ion pumps, okay, cytochrome pumps. Movement of ions occur against concentrations gradients. Okay, why it requires energy? Because the elements required is being transferred from lower concentrations to higher concentrations gradients, so it more difficult. It cannot occur spontaneous, so it requires energy expenditure. Rate of absorptions is depend on respirations. Why? Because respirations will produce energy. Okay, so because active transport require energy, the absorptions process or transport process will highly depends on the respirations. And the other one, the rate of absorptions is not being influenced by transpirations process. Okay, kalau macam passive tadi, the transpirations rate will influence the absorptions of the elements. Okay, so ada soalan tak? Saya seram lah nak masuk minggu kelima ni, banyak sangat topik yang perlu kita bincangkan, tapi kita with limited times. Okay, so tak ada masalah. Kalau lepas kelas pun awak tak faham, you are welcome to ask me questions. Okay? So macam ada students, dia text message saya tengah malam, pukul 2-3 pagi. Okay, so saya faham lah, masa saya students pun biasanya kita study tengah-tengah malam kan, seronok sikit. Tapi bila tengah study tu ada benda yang awak tak faham, so awak takut esok terlupa nak tanya, awak boleh just WhatsApp saya. Of course lah saya tak reply immediately, sebab biasanya malam tu saya akan silence saya punya phone. Okay, tapi bila pagi bila saya tengok tu, so saya akan ambil masa untuk explain. Okay, so any questions? Ada siapa-siapa yang nak tanya soalan? Ada soalan tak orang tanya?
Tak ada.
Semua okey je?
Okey.
Okey.
Ya, semua
Okey doktor.
baguslah awak. Semua faham. Okey. So kita rehat 3 minit ya. 10.50 nanti kita sambung balik. So nanti kita sambung untuk topik minggu kelima. Boleh?
Boleh,
Lihat
doktor. Boleh.
minit.
Boleh, doktor.
Sorry student, saya tak nak masuk topik baru. Saya nak tunjukkan awak video. Okay. So nanti petang kita akan sambung topik baru. We will discuss about growth and developments. So growth and developments satu topik yang berat. Okay. Okay, boleh nampak skrin saya ke?
Boleh.
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 Ada video. Okay.
Like all living organisms, plants need nutrients for their proper growth and development. Oxygen and hydrogen from air and water to carry out photosynthesis, which is a very important process for plants. But what about mineral nutrients? Where do they get their mineral nutrients from? The answer is soil. The presence of minerals in soil, but rocks undergo various...
Awak boleh dengar ke video saya? Boleh nampak ke?
Boleh
Boleh.
dengar.
Boleh dengar, boleh nampak. Boleh.
Oh, sebab tadi baru keluar stop presenting. Okay, tak apa. Sorry ya.
Chemical and physical mechanical changes, leaving behind these mineral elements in the soil as a result. These minerals in soil are either in absorbable or in dissolved form. So to absorb the minerals from the soil, plants use their roots and in some cases, their leaves. The mineral nutrients absorbed have many functions and roles to play in the body of plants. They are constituents of various proteins, pigment, nucleic acids, and enzymes. They also play roles in cell signaling and metabolism. Plants take up these mineral nutrients in the form of ions. This uptake of minerals can either be a passive process, termed as passive transport, which takes place along the concentration gradient, thus requiring no energy, or an active process, termed as active transport, which requires energy because it occurs against the concentration gradient. The passive process transport or absorption can be explained by diffusion theory, the ion exchange theory, and Donan's equilibrium. Diffusion theory. When the concentration of mineral ions is higher in the external soil solution than the root, then the ions in the soil solution will move from a region of higher concentration, in this case the soil solution, to a region of lower concentration, that is the roots. This movement of molecules or ions is called diffusion. The ions keep moving inside until an equilibrium is reached. One of the reasons that allows the ions to diffuse into the root cells is because of the apparent free space. However, unlike non-charged molecules, ions will have difficulty to pass through the hydrophilic membrane directly. To facilitate the movement, the proteins called channel proteins and carrier proteins are needed. Ion exchange theory. In this process, the ions, mainly cations, that are absorbed to the root surface due to the negative charge of the cell wall are exchanged with the ions present in soil. The positively charged hydrogen ions absorbed into the surface of the roots can easily be exchanged with cations of sodium and potassium present in the soil. Similarly, an anion like hydroxyl ion from the root cell can be exchanged with anion present in the soil. Ion exchange can be explained by contact exchange theory. According to contact exchange theory, ions can be taken up the plant without being dissolved in soil. The ions absorbed onto the root surface and the ions attached to clay particles are not entirely static. They oscillate in a small volume of space, and if the roots of plant and the soil particles are in close proximity, that the oscillation volume of the ions overlap, ion exchange can take place. The exchanged ions enter the root by diffusion. Carbonic exchange theory. Roots of the plants continuously respire, which results in production of carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide produced during respiration in roots combines with water to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate ion. The hydrogen ions produced as a result are exchanged with cations in soil. Donan equilibrium. Another theory of passive absorption is Donan's equilibrium theory, which states that there are some ions inside the root cells that are indiffusible across the membrane due to the selective nature of the cell membrane. If the root cells have cations accumulated inside as indiffusible ions, then anions present in soil enter the membrane without expenditure of energy to maintain a balanced electrical potential. The movement of anions in this example will result in an equilibrium which may not be equal in terms of concentration. These mechanics enable plants to take up minerals from the soil to ensure their proper growth.
Okay, saya ada seconds video, dia ada video part yang kedua. Sekejap ya. Mana video tu?
Generally, the mineral ion concentration inside the cell can be higher than the surrounding soil. In this case, the ions move against the concentration gradient. That is from lower concentration to higher concentration. This movement is termed as active transport and requires energy. Two theories, carrier concept theory and electrochemical gradient theory, have been proposed to explain how ions are taken up by plants via active absorption. Carrier concept theory. According to the carrier concept, the movement of ions across a membrane is mediated by special carrier molecules present in the membrane. These carrier molecules are usually proteins, but they can also be cytochromes and lesser thin phospholipids. Generally, carrier molecule works by binding ions to the carrier molecule and forms a carrier ion complex, causing a change in the conformation of the carrier molecule. The carrier ion complex passes through the membrane. When it reaches the inner side of the membrane, the carrier molecule changes its conformation and releases the ion. After the release of the ion, the carrier moves back to the outer surface of the membrane to bind another ion. The binding of ion and its release both require energy, which is provided by ATP. Electrochemical gradient hypothesis. An electrochemical gradient exists across the plasma membrane of the cells. This is due to two things. 1. The splitting of water molecules into hydrogen and hydroxyl ions. 2. The conversion of ATP into ADP and PI, inorganic phosphate. The proton pumps in plasma membrane pump out hydrogen ions while hydroxyl ions stay inside the cell, giving inside of the cell negative charge. The proton concentration increases outside the cell than inside, generating a proton motive force. The electrical and proton gradients established as a result drive cation and anion uptake. Anions from outside the cell are exchanged with hydroxyl ions inside the cell, while the cations move inside the cell via ATPase. ATPase configuration changes as it binds the cation. It then transports the cation into the cell and changes back its configuration to bind another cation. This process is aided by the hydrolysis of ATP.
Okay. Any questions? The second video is more explanations about active transport. Okay. They are using ATP, okay, primary, or it use electrical chemical gradients ataupun dalam secondary active transport. Dah pukul 11. Ada soalan tak? Any questions? Iklima, okay? Dekat Mahalah?
Tak ada soalan.
Tak ada soalan? Mas Rizal, okay?
Okey, doktor.
Okay. Izzah? Izzah, ada soalan Izzah?
Okey, doktor.
Semua okay ya? Wanun Nasrin, okay?
Okey, doktor.
Faham? Semua? Oh, saya lupa bagi tahu awak. As we plan, you will have a quiz pada minggu ketiga and also in week 5. Kan? Minggu kelima kan? Minggu ni adalah minggu kelima. So nanti saya akan upload quiz dekat e-taklim. And for your midterms, awak punya midterms bila nak buat? So minggu pertama saya dah terangkan, kita akan buat midterms minggu ke-8. Okay. So midterms topik questions that will be yang akan ditanya untuk midterms awak adalah topik pada minggu pertama sampailah topik pada minggu ke-5. Okay. Untuk Dr. Fauzihan punya tak akan masuk dalam midterms. Midterms kita akan buat secara online. Okay. Kita akan menggunakan e-taklim. So you will be given a specific time 1 jam ataupun 2 jam. And awak perlu sign in ke satu laman web. Okay. So laman web tu dia akan rekodkan Windows awak. Awak pergi Windows mana. So kalau masa tu, kalau awak buka Windows e-taklim saja, so awak tak akan ada masalah. Tapi kalau awak buka Windows Google, nota PDF ataupun PowerPoint, kita akan record awak punya activities. Okay. So untuk midterms, there will be MCQ, multiple choice questions, there will be short answer dan juga essay. Okay. So jangan takutlah, kalau awak tak faham, just tanya je saya. Okay. So any questions before we end our sessions for today? We will continue our class at 3. Ada soalan tak?
Doktor.
Quiz tu topik minggu ke-4 dengan minggu ke-5. Okay. Soalan saya tak upload lagi. So saya akan pilih soalan daripada bank soalan saya. Saya ada banyak soalan, so saya akan pilih. So nanti tengoklah. Bila saya dah upload, nanti saya akan inform dekat awak. Okay. Minggu ke berapa yang perlu awak study. Okay. So ni ada question. So saya minta maaf terpaksa. Ya.
Nanti doktor boleh tolong uploadkan untuk slide next lecture.
Oh, minggu ni saya tak upload lagi kan?
Tajuk growth development ke doktor?
Ya, growth development.
Oh, okay.
No, growth development. Saya tak upload lagi. Sebab slide tu dekat 70 slide. So saya tengah edit tadi. Saya nak reduce balik. Okay. So macam certain topics, plant cell wall, saya tak akan sentuh. Sebab kalau saya sentuh, kita dah belajar cell wall pada minggu pertama. Okay. Plant cell. So saya tak naklah topik tu redundant untuk masuk minggu ni. Leaf developments, root developments, cell differentiations, topic that focus really on growth and developments. Okay. Okay, any other questions? Tak ada ya? So if there are no questions, so kita jumpa lagi pukul 3. Sorry, I have to end our sessions earlier, and thank you for your times and for your attentions. Assalamualaikum.